It was the kind of night when the wind howled through the trees, making the skeletal branches tap ominously against the windows. In the small, isolated town of Ravenswood, the residents knew to stay indoors after dark. There were stories, whispers of strange occurrences and eerie happenings that had plagued the town for generations. But these were just old wives' tales, weren't they? 26-year-old Emma Harrington didn't think so. She had grown up hearing the legends, the most infamous of which was about the abandoned house on the hill, the so-called Morrison House. Built in the late 1800s, the mansion had once been the pride of Ravenswood, but it had been abandoned for decades. The townsfolk said it was cursed, and those who dared to stay there overnight were never the same. Emma didn't believe in curses. She was a journalist after all, practical, rational, and determined to find the truth. So when the editor assigned her to write a piece on local legends, she knew where she had to go. Emma packed her things and drove up the winding road to the Morrison House. As she approached, the massive, Gothic structure loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless like the hollow eyes of a skull. The front gate creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the wind seemed to grow colder as she stepped onto the property. The door to the house was unlocked, as if inviting her in. Emma hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, before pushing it open. The inside of the house was just as she imagined, dusty, cold, and filled with the scent of decay. She set up her camera, recording every creak and groan of the old house as she explored. The night wore on, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. Disappointed, Emma sat down in what appeared to the living room, surrounded by old, moth-eaten furniture. SH pulled out her phone to check the time. It was just after midnight. And that's when she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible tapping sound coming from upstairs. Emma froze, her blood running cold. She listened intently, trying to determine if it was just the wind or something more sinister. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing through the otherwise silent house. Determined not to let her nerves get the better of her, Emma grabbed her flashlight and cautiously made her way upstairs. The sound grew louder as she ascended, leading her to a door at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping was coming from inside. Taking a deep breath, Emma pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair by the window. The chair was moving, slowly rocking back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. But there was no one there. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped closer to the chair, her flashlight illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, and the room was plunged into an eerie silence. That's when Emma noticed something she hadn't seen before: a small, antique telephone on a table next to a chair. It was an old rotary phone, the kind that hadn't been in use for decades. But it was ringing. Slowly, Emma reached out and picked up the receiver, her hand trembling. "Hello," she whispered. For a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then, a voice, a low, raspy whisper that sent shivers down her spine, spoke. "Get out, now." Emma's heart leaped into her throat. She dropped the phone and ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably, before finally managing to start the engine. She sped down the hill, not daring to look back. When she reached the safety of her apartment, she tried to convince herself it was all in her head, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew what she had heard. And she wasn't the only one. The next morning, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She reviewed the footage she had taken at the Morrison house, hoping to find some logical explanation for what had happened. But as she watched, something strange caught her eye. In the footage from the living room, just before she heard the tapping, there was a shadow, a dark, human-shaped figure standing in the corner of the room. It was there for only a second before disappearing, but it was enough to send chills down her spine. Emma knew she couldn't ignore this. She had to find out more about the house and the voice on the newspapers and town records. What she found was disturbing. The Morrison House had once belonged to a man named William Morrison, a wealthy but reclusive businessman who had lived there with his wife, Eleanor, in the early 1900s. The couple was known to be private, almost to the point of secrecy. In 1923, both William and Eleanor were found dead in the house under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but there were stories of madness, of a curse that had driven them to take their own lives. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the years, several people who had moved into the house had either died or gone mad. The last recorded incident was in 1987, when a family of 4 disappeared without a trace. The house had been abandoned ever since. Emma's research led her to the town's oldest resident, a woman named Margaret O'Hara, who was in her 90s but still sharp as a tack. When Emma mentioned the Morrison House, Margaret's face darkened. "You shouldn't have gone there, dear," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "That house, it's not just haunted. It's evil. William Morrison dabbled in things he shouldn't have: dark rituals, forbidden knowledge. He wanted power, and he got it, but at a terrible cost." Margaret went on to explain that William had been obsessed with communicating with the dead, and he had built a special room in the house, a room designed to act as a portal between the worlds of the living and the dead. That room, she said, was where the telephone was found. Emma felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as Margaret spoke. She knew she had to go back to the house, to find this room and uncover the truth. But Margaret warned her against it. "Once you've been marked by that house, it won't let you go," Margaret said. "You'll be drawn back there, whether you want to or not. And the next time, you might not make it out." Despite the warning, Emma was determined. That night, armed with new information and a renewed sense of purpose, she returned to the Morrison House. The house was just as she had left it, silent and foreboding. Emma made her way to the upstairs room with the rocking chair. This time, she searched the room thoroughly, looking for any hidden doors or passageways. After what felt like hours, she found a trapdoor hidden beneath an old rug. The door creaked as she pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Emma hesitated for only a moment before descending into the unknown. The air grew colder as she went deeper into the house, the darkness almost suffocation. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was a large, circular stone with a strange, intricate pattern carved into it. Next to the stone was another antique telephone, identical to the one upstairs. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She could feel an oppressive energy in the room, as if the very air was alive with malevolence. She knew this was the portal Margaret had spoken of. As she approached the stone, the telephone began to ring, echoing loudly in the confined space. Emma stared at it, her heart pounding, but she knew she had to answer it. With trembling hands, she picked up the receiver. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This time, the voice on the other end was clearer, more insistent. "You should have left when you had the chance," it hissed. "Now, it's too late." The line went dead, and the room was plunged into an eerie silence. Emma felt a sudden rush of fear, as if she was being watched. She spun around, but there was no one there, only shadows. Suddenly, the symbols on the walls began to glow with a sickly, greenish light. The stone in the center of the room started to pulse, emitting a low, humming sound that grew louder and louder until it was almost unbearable. The room began to spin, and Emma felt as if she was being pulled toward the stone, her body moving against her will. She struggled to break free, but it was no use. The force was too strong. Just as she was about to be pulled into the stone, she heard a voice that wasn't coming from the telephone. It was a man's voice, calm and commanding. "Stop." The force suddenly released her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The glowing symbols faded, and the room was once again plunged into darkness. When Emma looked up, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, dark figure with piercing eyes. "Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, and Emma could see him more clearly. He was a man in his late 30s, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. There was something familiar about him, something that made Emma's blood run cold. "My name is William Morrison," the man said. "And you need to leave this place. Now." Emma couldn't believe her ears. William Morrison? The man who had died nearly a century ago? But before she could ask any more questions, the house began to shake violently, as if it were being torn apart. "Go!" William shouted, "you don't have much time." Emma didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled to her feet and ran up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was coming alive around her. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the windows rattled as if they were going to shatter. She could hear footsteps behind her, but she didn't dare look back. She burst through the front door and sprinted to her car, fumbling with the keys as she tried to unlock it. Just as she got the door open, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Emma screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The house loomed before her, dark and menacing, but it was silent once again. She jumped into her car and sped away, not daring to look back until she was safely home. Emma spent the next few days in a state of shock. She couldn't believe what had happened, couldn't believe she had encountered the ghost of William Morrison. She tried to rationalize it, to tell herself it was all just a bad dream, but the footage she had recorded told a different story. When she reviewed the footage from the hidden room, she could clearly see the glowing symbols, the pulsing stone, and the shadowy figure of William Morrison. It was undeniable something otherworldly had happened in that house. Emma knew she couldn't keep this to herself. She published her article, detailing everything she had experienced, complete with the footage she had captured. The story went viral, and soon, people from all over were flocking to Ravenswood to see the infamous Morrison House for themselves. But Emma never went back. She knew the house was dangerous, that it had a dark power that could consume anyone who got too close. She also knew that William Morrison's spirit was still trapped there, guarding the portal he had opened all those years ago. As for the phone calls, they never stopped. Every night at exactly midnight, Emma's phone would ring. She never answered, but she knew who it was. It was the house, calling her back, waiting for the day when she would return. And deep down, Emma knew that someday, she would.